Oh, sorry, y'all. You cut out there for a second, but the last thing that
Yeah.
we heard was,
And then we moved to.
and then we moved to.
Oh, and then yeah, we moved into like a typical product design kind of approach.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like I have a background in industrial design, so there's a lot of things that I have questions on. But the probably the most significant question I would have is like bringing all those stakeholders together is pretty difficult. I mean, unless you as the founder know CAD, like manufacturing, vendors, like overseas. How did you coordinate all these designers?
It's extremely complicated. Um, you know what? I started, by going back to the designer of my previous company, Casita, and I met the founder of SolidWorks, which any
Oh
industrial
yeah.
designer will be very familiar, and told them that we had designed this full home in SolidWorks, and he said that was the first time that anyone had done that, right?
Sick.
And so we also designed Jupe within SolidWorks as well with some of the same designers because the idea was, right, you could get a mass manufacturable product the same way that, you might design an iPhone or a pair of glasses or a pen or the other things that you use SolidWorks for. So I said, we're not going to use all these architectural programs. I'm not even going to hire an architect. We've never had an architect that worked at Jupe. I'm going to hire industrial designers and product designers. So the guy that actually is the main designer on the Jupe had a big part in designing the Cybertruck and the Cyber ATV. He actually patented the solar roof tiles. He's designed chocolate
Very
bars, all
cool.
sorts of stuff. And so I wanted someone coming out of that space to design this. And the first engineer we had was actually a structures engineer and the guy that built the prototype for the Starship, right? So if you ever saw that little Star Hopper, the first one that did
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
the guy that was the lead designer or engineer on that, we built the first Jupe in his garage. So, I'm trying to pull not from the traditional space of making shelter or, apartment buildings or ADUs or even, trailers. I'm trying to get folks from the places where they're solving some of these really hard problems.
We always say this to our clients when they're asking for someone, in a specific field or experience that design is more or less like industry agnostic. Unless it's like for a defense contractor, legal, fintech,
Yeah.
medical, like yeah, you probably want some like background experience. But just hearing, your lead designers worked on the Jupe, Cybertruck, chocolate bar. Those are not in the same industry.
Yeah. Right. Right. Like nice to have chocolate bar design, like in the
Well,
JD.
we also we shouldn't forget that the marshmallow and the Hershey bars are beautiful examples of
Oh, the
industrial
gorgeous,
design.
like the
Yeah,
design is gorgeous,
and graham
right? Like a
crackers for the
marshmallow,
smoke.
man. How
Right?
crazy is a
Yeah,
marshmallow?
yeah,
Who came up with that shit?
yeah.
Maybe we need to somehow use the inspiration of a marshmallow, right, for our next like housing project. I think we can go somewhere with this, guys.
Love
No,
that.
there's
Yeah.
definitely something there. Well, Jeff, like I don't know, you just dropped a whole bunch of knowledge. It makes me wonder, like, do you consider yourself a designer? Do you have a design background?
No. Um, I've always had a real appreciation for, I think, simplistic. I literally have this outfit that I'm wearing because it's laundry day and the jumpsuit that you met me in. I literally
Dude,
I have one jumpsuit
iconic jumpsuit.
that I wore, I think I track it like 328 days between Burning Mans. That same jumpsuit. And so jumpsuits are very functional. They're non-bifurcated, right? It's one piece of clothing, and I just love the design and the ideal, right, of one piece of clothing you can wear every day. And in fact, my dad just made a comment like, "Son, where's the jumpsuit?"
You're like, it's laundry day.
Because he hasn't seen me not in one in some time. I don't really, the way I got into this whole space is just is pretty strange. I was an environmental science professor and a dean. And after getting, I guess, sort of bored with at least the research side of that, I convinced the university to, as part of an educational experiment, let me move into a dumpster for an entire year. So,
was this a dumpster on campus?
It was on campus behind the dorms.
I heard you got a name, Professor Dumpster.
Yeah, that's where I
right?
got my name, Professor Dumpster. Can we share a screen here? Yeah, I think we can.
Yeah, you should be able to.
Let's share a screen here. So this will this record, I guess, as well?
It will, yeah.
So this was my dumpster the first night. I sold everything I owned for $1 an item, trying to just get down to the very basics core, right? People would throw trash in there that, when they didn't know it was actually my home. You can see like my hat and stuff in the base. That's the actual dumpster.
Go back to that.
This?
That's well designed. So these are your compartment storage?
This is where I really started to get interested in space. And, when you have a certain constraint put on you, like, hey, you've only got 33 square feet and 8 cubic yards for all your stuff in your living, right? You begin to think pretty carefully about literally every cubic centimeter of this space, totally. Right? And so I actually took a lot of inspiration from the dumpster and incorporated it into both Casita and Jupe. There's storage like this in the floor in the Jupe. So it allows you to have this kind of Zen plane, right? Yeah. Yet have your stuff. So, I lived in this for a year. There was a point where the trash trucks came for me. And all kinds of other perils of living in dumpsters. So in the end, I tricked it out, and that's what it looked like.
It doesn't even look like it. For anyone that is listening on Anchor, Spotify, Apple, whatever, you need to stop and watch the YouTube.
You got to go to YouTube.
Yeah, if you just Google like Professor Dumpster, or there's a good Atlantic piece. Like, people just started showing up when I did this. Right, I saw no sort of attention for it, but. I also played this character called Professor Dumpster. I got all my water out of Lake Austin for the first 6 months. And so here I'm like showing this kid how I filtered my water. There was this, I would go to kids' schools and say, I live in this symbol of waste. What does Professor Dumpster need in his house to be happy? This kid won the all-time prize of,
a disco ball.
This kid probably got canceled at one point, but he said I needed a dumpster wife and a disco ball and, a sink. The kid's thinking about design. He's got a false floor in here, some curtains. That's pretty much all Professor Dumpster needs to have a happy life.
And so go on.
Oh no, that's kind of the end of it there.
Well, so how long were you in there?
1 year. For any Doctor Who fans, I had a thing saying it's bigger on the inside. A TARDIS there. I was in there a year, and I learned a lot about small space design. I learned a lot about coding and zone, right? Because this thing was completely illegal. The city would come around sort of telling me it wasn't a livable unit, or I couldn't put it there or there. I found places I actually could put it, that there were no laws. And the ability to just get up and move quickly is something I incorporated into Jupe.
It almost sounds like that. I mean, to get up and move quickly can be a mantra for most startups, I think.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And I want to go back to this word constraints, because I think a lot of startups they don't work within constraints, and it's a little bit misguided. And I want to get your thought. The reason why I think it's misguided is because their intentions are good, where they're saying like, let's not be constrained, let's like, let's blue sky think, let's take it to the moon. But what does constraints, in your opinion, do for a startup?
Well, I think the equation is, there's a time plus constraints, right? Or, I guess it's an inverse relationship with time, right? If you can shorten the length of time, right, that is necessary to do something, and increase the constraints that are sort of correct, I think that's when you can get something pretty interesting. Now, time is generally kind of set by your burn and your funding and runway, right? But the whole team's not often aware of that. And then, constraints, a lot of it is actually figured out by just iterations and failure, right? Like my last startup, I did not have a lot of these shipping constraints on there, and I didn't have cost constraints. And I actually made a mistake with this first Jupe as well. It was not even a Tesla Roadster. It was like a Lambo, right? It was way too expensive. So on this next iteration for this disaster relief, we're designing around very strictly around cost as well.
And on the subject of designing around cost, some of the places where Harris and I oftentimes find ourselves drawing inspiration is in the industrial design and Adam's world around successful examples, right, of design projects that have designed within cost. Obviously, in America, Target comes to mind. In Japan, Uniqlo and Muji come to mind. Scandinavia, IKEA, number one consumer of timber in the world.
Yeah.
OG nonprofit.
Yeah. Where did you seek inspiration for designing within cost for Jupe? Like, what are examples that really inspired you?
Well, I mean, frankly, I did not seek enough of those. Right? Like, I mean, Jupe initially, this initial product is, the glamping product's way too expensive, right? I think, rather than specific products where I was trying to design around cost, I mean, there are a few little products I just absolutely love. One of them are those Italian, I guess, what are they called? But the aluminum coffee.
Oh, yeah.
Those things are so simple. They need no filters. The design has lasted forever.
In every ID class.
I used one this morning. I didn't go to design school, but and I'm also just... and I guess this means more now in the AI era, but I've always just been fascinated by paper clips, right? And just the simplicity of that design. It's one wire, a couple of bins, and it can do some pretty incredible things, including, I guess, if the paperclip maximizer scenario, it can turn the entire galaxy into paper clips. If you've heard that, if not, Google paperclip maximizer. It's I guess AI safety thing.
Wow. And so did you in this new iteration of Jupe, did you draw any explicit inspiration from paperclip design or any of these others into what it is now?
I think we drew there was some inspiration from kind of the almost a jewel, right? How the Cybertruck is sort of has all of those planes on it. When you look at the Jupe, you'll see something sort of similar to that. I mean, frankly, I think the philosophy that I'm now enforcing, on this second iteration of it is going to be just trying to get to as few parts as possible, right? Like we were trying to solve to get away from as much labor, to outsource things. The Jupes as they are sort of like IKEA furniture. Speaking of IKEA furniture, they are CNC'd and then kind of put together in an engineered, like a rigid way, such that we don't have a lot of different materials, but there's still way too many parts.
And have you found that as you reduce the number of parts involved, does it have the predicted effect of making assembly easier or lowering the skill threshold for assembly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to move from about, I don't know, 224 parts in the current chassis, which I can go back to why we call it that as well. I think we can get this down to one part, basically a stamped mold, right? A kind of tub that can achieve a very similar sort of thing.
Is it like a
Now,
polyplastic or what
yeah,
do you?
yeah,
Yeah,
it'll be a polyplastic. I mean, one part for the kind of, maybe not all 224 of those down to one, but that's what I told the engineer that I wanted to see, and his eyes rolled back in his head. I was like, I think you can get it to one. So the chassis part of this that I brought up, really what inspired Jupe, was seeing this skate, what Rivian calls their
yeah,
skateboard chassis.
yeah.
And so the idea here, right, is that you can have this one chassis, which is not a new idea, and change out motors, batteries, and sort of configure it in different ways. And then you can put a truck on top, right, a sedan, a van, these kind of different things. And so the idea is if we could build this chassis that had all these interchangeable kind of parts and modules, we called it intra-modular. Then you could do some pretty interesting things. And I'm not sure if I have. Yeah, we could begin to do things like this, right, with the same chassis, where we can turn it into a garden or a bathroom, right, different kinds of shelters or even hard tops, and then eventually turn those chassis into big batteries, right? Water tanks, gray, black, and fresh water tanks. So if we've got that unit, right, that chassis that we can move around and stack very efficiently, now we can use that volume for basically everything you would need to have a mobile city, a mobile town, right? All the
It
infrastructure would become decoupled from the grid.
it almost, looking at this reminds me of two things. One, Joe Gebbia's ADU startup,
Yep.
which is just so sexy. And then the second is how NASA packages up. There's this great documentary. I think it's on Netflix or HBO, but it follows it's on Disney Plus under Nat Geo. But they follow the James Webb Telescope
Mm.
and how much they had to pack into tiny containers.
Mm.
And when you're able to do that, it just goes back to what you were saying, like shipping air. People don't really think about the industrial design behind shipping, but the shipping influences the design so much. And I wonder, could you comment on how maybe that might relate to startups, when they're thinking about launching an MVP?
Mm. Go into that a little bit more. Like, yeah, could you reframe that a little bit?
How do you not ship vaporware? How do you ship something like right now, the air that's being shipped today, I think is probably like text to anything built on top of OpenAI's API, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, out of that selected bunch, probably the only useful tool or the only useful software is ChatGPT itself or Jasper AI, right? That is kind of refining the foundational technology. And
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of companies out there right now that are just shipping air.
That's a
You know?
great, yeah. I think maybe we should have another podcast called just shipping air, where you look at, yeah. So this idea, like as a metaphor, when I was said shipping air, I literally meant volumes of air,
Yeah.
right?
Wait, you meant like volumes of air, as in like literally like we're shipping like a liter of like
Exactly.
empty
But
space.
I love this metaphor. We should roll with this as a conversation of
I,
shipping air, right?
but
Because
yeah.
yeah, because like this is a thing. I literally, renders, and now with AI, right, have gotten so fucking good.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, even for industrial designers, a few times I've had to I can zoom all the way and I've had to send, more and more often I'll see something and have to send it to one of the industrial designers and say, bro, I can't tell if this is a render or not. And so
Yeah.
very specifically, and it's going to get that way with video as well, there's all this vaporware out there, particularly in housing, because it's such a hard thing to build something the size of a house that someone could actually live in and then deploy, that I just put on, I say this is a render or this is an actual photo on most of our stuff, because you just can't tell a lot of times if something's real. There's a lot of air that, as you put it, that's shipped out there.
You
Vapor
have
air.
to. Yeah.
Vapor air, yeah, not vaporware, but vapor air, yeah, exactly.
This whole topic just reminds me of some Steve Jobs lore. Who knows if it's real, but there's this famous scene where two of his designers and engineers come into his room. Mr. Jobs, we got it. Like, here's the iPhone, and he's like, oh, we can't make it any smaller. No, Mr. Jobs, this is the best that it's gonna get. And he just walks over to his fish tank and just drops it in and watches all the bubbles. And he's like,
Yeah, I've heard this story. Yeah, that's air.
that's room
Make
for
it
iteration.
smaller. Yeah. Yeah.
So what happens? Like, let's press fast forward a little bit. Where's Jupe now today, and how'd you get there?
So, Jupe right now, we've made about 250 units. We're, call it a couple to 2.5 years old. We went through Y Combinator, I guess a year or so after you guys did. We're in the midst of a full turning the ship pivot, right? The brand was set up to be around outdoor hospitality, glamping, right? We always had this bigger mission of wanting to go after the 1.6 billion folks that are unhoused or that aren't adequately housed. And so, yeah, I mean, I've just sent out in the last 24 hours as you do, an update to my investors, the first one in a few months, that said, FYI, everyone, we are pivoting the entire company. So we're stopping manufacturing. We're ordering no more parts on these existing Jupes. I built one prototype. We've actually we've done all the industrial design and engineering. Actually, our main engineer was, I believe, the main engineer on that project of Joe Gebbia's. So he's
Really?
come
Oh,
over
funny.
to Jupe since. And that project has a very interesting background. It looks sick. It is sick, but it made a lot of people sick on the way getting to what they have, including they spun it all the way out of Airbnb.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's pretty exacting standards on that team. Like, when did you know it was time to pivot? Like, is there like a landmark event? I mean, obviously we read your and for anyone that doesn't know, Bookface is like almost like an internal Facebook for YC founders, and he was he wrote basically this post, got a lot of did you post it publicly?
No, I haven't posted
No.
it publicly.
Yeah,
It was just
for you, that was something that was quite vulnerable. I mean, are you willing to get into some of that vulnerability?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, anybody that's lived in a dumpster has certainly exposed his vulnerable side. Yeah, I mean, look, the glamping thing was working okay, but it wasn't working great. right?
How'd you make that distinction between okay?
Yeah.
Well, they say like YC. I mean, we're all drinking the YC Kool-Aid here still, but like
The orange
I'll
juice.
continue. Yeah, orange juice. Mine was spiked by someone. So this idea of like real product market fit, right? It's not okay. It is like when you are absolutely just swamped and trying to tread water under a waterfall, right? Like, and we never got to that. It's only a $3 billion market, glamping, relative to this market's at least 300 billion, right? So that was part of it. And then, when the Hawaii stuff happened, I think I wrote in this post that another founder in this space that had a housing startup called Rent the Backyard.
Right.
I don't know if he was in y'all's batch or what, but he just texted me and said, "Hey, could you get those Jupes over to Hawaii?" And that was really the moment where, I woke up the next morning and said, "Okay, well, we're just going to do this, right? Even if it
Yeah.
kills us."
Yeah, yeah, and that's actually, speaking of orange juice, like Michael Seibel often talks about how, like, that you have a solution that people need on their hands if they're coming to you and their hair's on fire and you're like, cinder blocks, come get your cinder blocks, and
Yeah.
they're like, oh my god, a fire extinguisher, and you're like, no, it's like that's bad for your head, and they just start like banging their head against your cinder block because their hair's on fire.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, no, it's
love it.
literally and
That
this one though,
sounds very much like a Michael Seibel anecdote. Yeah.
yeah, sort of like pain and fire and stuff, but like
That's his vibe.
but
sure.
like yeah, in this case, literally there were like fires raging in Hawaii, right?
Yeah.
And you guys like had this thing that was a credible candidate for the job to be done,
Yeah.
right? Which is like people have lost their shelter. So tell us about your experience, like, getting Jupe out to Hawaii. Like, what was that like?
Well, look, we're still learning right now things by trying to ship those that we're going to incorporate into the product. In fact, we're just going to send probably one set of these Jupes over there just to kind of learn for now how folks are using them, how they ship. So, going back to design, these Jupes that we have that we are sending to Hawaii, that we're still struggling like with the port with getting them into container. They were designed to go onto a flatbed truck, right? Well, they won't fit in a container. They weren't designed to be narrow enough to go in a container. So we're having to turn them on their sides. And we had to design a whole packaging system. I went and got some folks to volunteer from Rivian, which is ironic, that we can fit 9 of these glamping Jupes into a container, but it's a very expensive kind of process. So the next one we're designing is designed to actually fit in a container. Then I'm not doing what I'm doing now, is loading them on a truck in Texas, finding a warehouse somewhere in LA, building all the packaging, right? Getting them in there, getting them then on the boat. Had they just fit into 40-foot containers, we could have had hundreds there.
Was this a consideration, like fitting into the shipping container? Was this something that you guys considered as a possible constraint to allow for, like in an earlier iteration of Jupe?
No, no, we hadn't. And the reason why was we were trying to maximize comfort, right, and reduce the amount of air volume we were shipping. So when you go from 8.5 feet wide, which is what the Jupes are now, to, call it 7 feet, 10 inches wide to fit in a container, that's a big difference. And I can tell you, just like in the dumpster, I remember just adding like a couple of inches on adding some insulation at one point, taking 2 inches from both sides. I eventually ended up taking the insulation out because it just reduced it was worth getting a little hot and cold just to have the extra space.
Go back because you had said that you were able to get some people over from Rivian to kind of help out with this. Agree and I have had our share of dark days when we're pivoting, and it can be a really, really dangerous spot, not only to like, a founder psyche, but also to like the stakeholders and etc. How did you find yourself inspiring the Rivian team to come over, your own team to, to stay, or like maybe a select few to stay and, see this through with you, and then also like yourself? Like, where did you find that from?
Man, I mean, it's an insightful question that, you know, can only really come from someone that's been through that, generally another founder. That's why it's great to be able to listen to you guys and you guys chat, right? Because a lot of times you can't even discuss these things with your team. So,
Yeah.
It's so hard.
starting with just from the outside, there's something very core um, to humans and to humanity and human nature that when you see others in extreme pain or need, folks want to help, right? And so it probably wasn't so much me, but just the state of the situation over there immediately. And a lot of folks, um, knew Maui well, had been over there, volunteered. It was a pretty close place to Lahaina, to his heart. Um, and then, man, just as founders going through this stuff when times get tight, it's really hard. It's really hard. And frankly, I don't think I could have even made it, to today talking to you guys without the other founders, a lot of them that I met in the batch, and sort of sharing with them. Before I made that post, I shared it with two or three of, founders from my batch that gave me
Yeah.
some insights on it. And that network, that kind of social network of folks is really, really important. It's the only shoulders you can really cry on.
It can get like quite emotional even when Agree and I are thinking about, our past. And I remember just this overwhelming feeling of shame
Yeah.
and guilt and comparison to others, or maybe even people I like went to high school with that I don't even talk to. It's like, where are they now? Where's everyone else now?
Right.
And yeah, I wonder like what were some of the emotions that you were going through, and yeah.
Well, still am, bro. Like we're not out of it. Like, I mean,
Hell yeah.
um, just you know, being vulnerable and transparent. Like this was not a like, hey investors, everything's amazing. We're pivoting because it's going to be fun, and it was like, guys, we need to fucking do this and figure it out, and it's serious, right? Um, it is. It's a really really hard thing to go through, and there's a lot of shame to it, right? There is the feeling that you're letting folks down, right? Whether it's investors, but in this case, if you've got, a mission like we do, is I just think about those 110, 120 million folks that
Yeah.
in some, potential future, in some corner of the multiverse, in some, non-zero probability that Jupe could solve problems for those folks. And I think it needs to exist in the world. Um, we're going to try our damn make that turn, but if we don't, I'll come back again. I just
Yeah.
don't think I can do anything else. And I'll tell you, one of the things, they love to just hammer on Silicon Valley and San Francisco, right? And it's so easy now with, cruise vehicles allegedly running over people, and down at 7th and Market, the sort of fentanyl crisis. And these things are, at least the latter one, these are big deals. But like, I will tell you one thing that isn't that sets San Francisco and the Bay Area and Silicon Valley apart from anywhere else in the world is that failure is valued, right?
Yeah.
It's not, it's almost better to have a super hard failure than it is just a very soft landing, cold death to the universe, right? In a weird way.
Further than A16Z and WeWork.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I mean, and so that gives me a little bit of confidence. It doesn't say that it doesn't make me like want to fail, but it does. I think more than anywhere else. If I was in finance in New York, right. Or if I was building factories in Germany, basically anywhere else in the world, they're not going to value failure. And what's great about Silicon Valley, you say, hey, you know what? I want to make another go at this. And people will say, oh, you failed last time? Okay, you learned some things? Great. I'm going to give you, I want you to make your vision bigger, and I'm going to give you money to try that. That's just crazy. Nobody does that.
Totally. And I mean, I think that this is one of the things I think about so often is like how it feels like actually like the idea of building a company is really like almost like the very last thing that's happening. When you look at Silicon Valley, it feels in a lot of ways more like the company is kind of like a convenient accounting trick or like a convenient accounting construct that is a way of modeling what is effectively really just like a giant distributed science experiment.
Absolutely.
Right? That like, yeah, you're just like people get research budget to do a mixture of basic science, applied science, microeconomics, right?
Yeah.
And if all those things interlock together, sociology, I think a lot of actually like go to market that works and is uniquely successful is effectively just sociologically insightful. It's not like, oh, like we got to get referral codes. Right?
And if you think about this is a great model. Like if you think about it, right, the way that you generally go about science, right, you start with the null hypothesis, which is a complete failure of the experiment. This is really hard to, teach when I was, as a professor for a while. Like to try to get it across to people that, no, we're going to start with, right, this null hypothesis, which is that everything's fucked up and nothing works, right?
Yeah.
And what we are trying to do is reject the null hypothesis to get this positive result. And if you think about Silicon Valley, the null hypothesis is that you are going to fail, right? 99. Right. So you are trying to reject the null hypothesis that you have failed, right? And so in a lot of ways, that's a really interesting way to think about it as a big science experiment. And I think that's what it is, and I think that would be a really valuable, like, way to deal with this on a psychological level when you can when you can frame things as Jupe is a big experiment, not, it's a wanting to be $1 trillion market cap and, what is the CAGR of this market and what's our, lifetime value of a Jupe, like,
right.
It's like, okay, this is one big experiment. The null hypothesis is that we will fail at this, and we're trying to reject that, right, and actually get to success.
Right, and I think that like the way you've even described your various sort of swings at bat, both with Jupe and before Jupe. Again, it seems like one common theme that like I see through them is that one, it does not really look like the mission has changed. Right, you're out to like crack this question of why is it so hard to get people who don't have shelter, right?
Yeah.
And it used to be called Casita, and now it's called Jupe again. And you have different working hypotheses as to like the why and the solution. And I mean, for us with Numi, I used to, especially like even a year ago, I used to be like really kind of ashamed that we had spent like 4 years trying to make stuff happen in Kenya when it came to like e-commerce, and sometimes we got somewhere, and then a lot of the times we didn't. But the thing that was this like unwavering conviction that we had was that essentially, like, if you can make marketplaces more liquid, if you can make the opportunity for people with a service to offer or a product to offer find the people who need their service or product, you can unlock so much human potential. And now, as the dust is starting to settle on like what our Africa chapter meant for us, it felt like it was actually, we had such ferocious conviction in this belief that we quit our day jobs in San Francisco, where we had very bright sort of careers ahead of us.
Literally on the surface delusional.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. And we booked one-way tickets to Nairobi to make it happen. It really like went down in flames. And when we picked ourselves back up, we were like, it may be obnoxious, but we still kind of believe this thing. We still like, and now we're just pursuing it in a way where our search through the Brownian solution space had us realize, oh, our edge is that like we have like sort of like an airport beagle's nose for identifying like a designer, right? A designer that hasn't been like uncovered yet, and competent designers are woefully in short supply.
It's really, really hard to find.
Yeah. And so it turned out that ended up being sort of the metabolic pathway that it seems to be working for us accomplishing our unshakable mission. So like, yeah, as two people who've been through it before, I'm sure we'll probably go through it again. Like, it's this is the hard part.
And I think about that, right? I contemplate failure a lot, right? Specifically when you're getting into these harder conditions, right? When the as PG calls it, like the fatal pinch, right, kind of situation. But then I think about like, what else am I going to do? I think most co-founders are unemployable, probably, or at least unemployable in a way that both the employer and the co-founder would be happy.
Yep.
The thing is that you see over and over, right? The startup fails, they go work for Google for like maybe 18 months and then get so frustrated, like they're right back at it. And so I think about it like, I don't know what else I would do. I really don't. And I'd have to go back at it.
Real talk, that has been the defining pillar of solace during the really, really, really hard times. It's like getting to the place where it's like almost like, all right, like really nothing's working. Okay, Jeff, to give you a sense of how bleak it once got, we got an email from our accountant being like, you have so little money in the bank that I don't know if you'll be able to pay me.
Like, we gotta let you go.
Yeah, imagine your accountant being like, hey, what do you want to do about this upcoming month? Because I think the size of my meager invoice might teeter you guys into bankruptcy, right? And I like pulled up the job board, like looked at like, jobs at like Stripe. I was like, this is probably the company I'd be working at if I weren't starting a company right now.
And you know what the craziest thing is, Agreed?
Yeah.
It wasn't actually us that pulled us out of Africa. It had to be a global virus. Like, it had to be a pandemic that literally like pulled us out. And it was only until months after did we finally begin to see like, whoa, this is not working. Like, for yourself, how did you find, were there clues along the way that something wasn't right? Did you actively, like, at least I did, like, I actively ignored them, hoping that if I stayed, it's like sunk cost fallacy, right? 101. But were there clues along the way for you?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things just not working, right? Like, we didn't just try glamping, we tried, festivals for a little while. We were going to try Burning Man. That didn't work. We even looked at making Jupe chassis that were small weed gardens with 6 weed plants in them that could be dropped off like greenhouses. We tried a toilet, right? Like, and we're trying again. I don't know if it'll work, right? You've got to just kind of keep testing these things until you figure it out or you die. Uh,
And what's the conviction behind this latest iteration?
Um, you know, going out to Maui, because I went out there to kind of look at the situation and then just talking to a lot more folks in this space. A lot of it is that there has been zero innovation, right? Like, they're still using kind of UN tents with mud floors that are used once. There's also the fact that the conditions in these camps are just horrible, and we want to do more of a distributed model by putting jupes in the backyards of like Airbnbs rather than packing them all into camps. Um, and then just the sheer scale of the problem. There was one flood in Pakistan not that long ago. 33 million people lost their home in one flood. Like, that's bigger than Texas. Imagine everybody in Texas losing, it's almost as big as California in one flood. And this is climate change related, right? This shit is just going to continue to quicken and get worse. And I don't know anybody else working on it, right? In terms of like a new housing, shelter solution. So we're going to make a go at it.
Think do you think that your mission is so humanitarian that it can't be entrepreneurial?
Um,
How do you like weigh those two things?
Yeah, I mean, and there's been this whole question of like, from my aunt, who was like, "Oh, you're profiteering off of other people's suffering," right? There is also that kind of angle, which I kind of thought, well, am I? What we're trying to do is solve the actual problem, right? And that problem will
For the record,
factor
it doesn't sound like it.
and
Yeah.
that yeah I that economics will factor into that, right? And so what I'm trying to do is not only innovate on the experience, the design, the delivery of these, but also on the business models, right? And looking at some creative ways to offset costs or reuse them. So for example, we want to develop a fleet of these jupes, right? And once you have a fleet that is rapidly deployable and redeployable, then you can do very interesting things like, hey, go pay them all off at Coachella. And now you essentially have a shelter you could essentially give away, right? Or, this idea of maybe you're a refugee in one country and you've stayed in a jupe, and that jupe's designed to go back with you when you go back to your country, right, with your stuff. And so by designing some different sort of things around mobility and how the business model works, or when there's a big flood, right, or a tornado or wildfire in the US, FEMA scrambles and essentially has to start bribing folks to take the housing stock off of them, or not bribing, but
Wow.
paying 2, 3, 5x. What if I could store 10,000 jupes in Kansas for $500 a month, right, to FEMA, and then have a 24-hour guarantee that we can get 10,000 shelters anywhere in the lower 48, right, without them having to go, you know, put these together and scrape together housing for folks. So I think there's all kinds of different models that we can design to, right? Because these models have never been designed to. It's just like, let's make a cheap tent, right? Let's make a cheap tent and let's stick it somewhere, put people in it, sometimes for years, right? And then get rid of the tent.
Well, this you're obviously the best person to tell, but like, I mean, your experience.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's how I came to America. Was actually we were my family was in like a refugee camp, like with like those UN tents
Oh,
for six
wow.
weeks. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's not like I don't know. I feel like the R word kind of like is like an attention magnet, so I don't like draw too much attention to it. But like that's part of the origin story, right? Is that like yeah, my family was in a camp on the other side of the Iran-Iraq border. So I'm Iraqi Kurdish, and then sort of civil war broke out in '96, and we had to sort of relocate. And yeah, we were in tents in like a mountain ravine type situation. They set up a real quick camp there, and I went from that form of sort of like I guess you could say humanitarian shelter to like the Guam Air Force Base.
Mm.
So shout out Guam, shout out U.S. military. Very very grateful for NATO and being able to get out there. And yeah, it was like another type of shelter, but in that case, it was like more like I guess like military housing.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah. I mean, this is a thing that those tents that you're talking about, like in places where they get used as UN tents, they are single use, but like I'm sure you know also, right? They've got kind of like that tarp property to them.
Right.
So sometimes they get repurposed or they live a second life. They're like reincarnated as like construction augmentive material that they'll get used maybe to create like makeshift awnings or
Mm.
you know like shade for like a fruit vendor, and you can see the UNHCR logo on there still sometimes like maybe stitched over because
Huh.
the tarp is like 20 years old.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know that anybody has looked at this from like a design thinking perspective, right? And like what I want to do, I'm going to go to Pakistan, right? I want to go to Morocco. And I mean, there's stuff, right? When you go beyond natural disasters, right? What's happening in the Middle East right now and what's happening in Ukraine, right? Like, this is just, I mean, the number of displaced people grew by 30% last year. Now, a lot of that was the Ukrainian war, but still, imagine,
Yeah. Yeah.
because we're
Wow.
talking about 100 million people.
Right. 30, that is not a number that you want going up
No,
30% year over
but
year.
you think about like the next, this flood in Pakistan, like as the snow continues to melt off at higher, like this problem is not getting any better. So, it may be that we'll find those tents are the best solution in the end too, right? You've got to like I don't believe that, but they've been around a long time and there are reasons why they use them.
Yeah.
it almost seems like it almost seems like rooted in your vision. It's required. It's a prerequisite to have like uh a humanitarian outlook,
Yeah.
but the only way to execute it is to be an entrepreneur. And if you look at like even something like the closest analogy I have is like USPS. It's both a business and state run, but it's a utility at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean,
Everyone uses
I
it.
do still, I believe that capitalism is the rocket fuel, the jet fuel to make change.
For
It's
sure.
still the best thing that we have, right? There are a lot of things wrong with it, but to be able to go and raise money in Silicon Valley, to go after something like this, you're just not going to be able to piece together the funding that's willing to take risk on innovation in this space. So,
For sure.
I think there's a lot of interesting kind of structures evolving, like what Sam Altman and the OpenAI folks did, right, with capped returns and having a nonprofit, right, that was associated with the for. I don't understand all the mechanics. I think it's very complicated,
A little confusing to me.
but maybe there are some hybrid models. But I think going about it in just the grant writing, the sort of government funding, and sort of nonprofit funding, it's just too slow.
It's way too slow. I
Exactly.
think the closest thing that is a double bottom line company,
Hmm.
right? Like Tom Shoes or I think Lush,
Maybe
but
Warby Parker.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's just like that. Not only does that naturally create better companies, but it also inspires a lot of other companies. And if yeah, I'd wonder what would happen to our outlook on the earth, on humanity, if all companies were required before they start to become a double bottom line company. Like, how much more well designed would each company be? How much more considerate would you be towards your customer? Would you even call them a customer or user anymore? Or are you now calling them people that use your product,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Just, yeah, very, very interesting to think about.
So, Jeff, close us out here. Do you have anything that you want to leave people with who are listening to this? Maybe it's a designer trying to figure out how they can leave a deeper thumbprint in the world. Maybe it's a founder that's going through a tough pivot right now. Maybe it's someone who doesn't doesn't have shelter for all the various reasons that people lose theirs.
Maybe it's for your future self.
Yeah, I think what I've learned through this experience is if you are going to pivot, hopefully you can found the company on this in the beginning, but pivot towards your own beliefs
Hmm.
and what you believe the world to need and what you want to work on in filling that need. Because, there are near infinite ways you can pivot, right? And it's always into the fog, right? But if you know that your own sort of belief and values in a specific problem or ideal are out there in that fog somewhere, it makes it a lot easier to wander into it.
Words of
Well said.
wisdom.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for coming
Yeah,
on, man.
thanks,
This was
guys.
great.
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Really enjoyed it. Hope we get to talk again.
Oh, likewise.